What's the most legendary work meltdown you've seen? Story 1. This happened only a couple days ago at work. I didn't see it, but everyone's been talking about it. Apparently, Agnes came up to Betty and slapped her on the hard hat and said, "Learn how to do your job." And Betty just lost her and went full UFC on Agnes. Chokehold, face punches, regular choking. Agnes tried to defend herself with various building parts as weapons. Both are now fired, but I really don't blame Betty. Agnes is a annoying and has been pushing everyone's nerves since she started working. I wouldn't want someone like that walking around treating coworkers that way. Someone was bound to take her down a peg eventually. Story 2. My boss was pretty tightly wrapped. One day I came into the restroom and there she was in a stall smearing her poop on the floor. I recognized her rings and muttering. When she was finished, she cleaned up the worst of it off the floor and somehow got dressed with her icky hands, got washed and went back to work. Story 3. When I was an intern, we had a really high-priority project come through that my mentor was working on. Really fast turnaround with many late nights, shitty coffee, and good beer. Anyways, it was toward the end of the project, and I was finishing bringing up on the board at my bench when I heard him muttering quietly to himself. I looked up to see if he needed me and watched him absolutely pound a computer monitor with his fist and then grab it and smash it down to the floor before stomping on it, screaming, "There's no goddamn error, you He calmed down after a bit, got a beer, and then requested a new monitor. That's when I learned that no matter what, how mad you are screaming at Altium will not make your sleep deprivation better. I love how he called it a Story 4. I was in court, lawyer, and we were arguing a motion and requesting sanctions against plaintiff's attorney. The judge starts talking and dressing down the plaintiff's attorney, who, now offended, decided it would be a great idea to interrupt the judge, insult the judge, and flat out tell him, "You are too stupid to make it in a private practice and you do not know what the you are doing." She had been licensed for all 3 years. She is no longer licensed. Story 5. A guy I delivered pizza with had his parking spot taken by a guy he hated. He pulled a giant monkey wrench out of his truck and smoked him in the back of the head with it. Knocked him out. Yeah, he got arrested and fired. Well, that escalated quickly from irritated to attempted homicide. Story 6. I worked in IT, and one guy, who was the most chilled guy I knew, was responsible for the development, updates, and maintenance of a specific product that generated high revenue. One afternoon, I was sitting at my desk and I just heard a big crash and saw one of his 3 monitors on the floor. He stood up, shoved the next monitor over the divider onto the next section's desk, then swiped the 3rd monitor off the other side, picked up his keyboard and smashed it as hard as he could, kicked his chair away, and slowly and calmly walked out of the department without saying a word. He came back to work the next day as if nothing happened. Everyone knew the pressure he was under and was very good at his job, so nobody said a word. Story 7. In high school, I worked at a grocery store and this kid was all pissed off at another bagger and swearing in front of the customers. He said he was hoping he'd get fired. I told him that he should quit before he gets fired so it would look better on his resume in the future. A few minutes later, I realized he was missing. Then suddenly, he comes around the corner from the manager's office, no longer in uniform. He threw his uniform in the trash in front of the manager. Then he looked at me and said loudly, "I took your advice." Then proceeded to walk to the front end, point to each associate saying "F you" to each of them, and walked out. Everyone was staring at me after, and I said, "I did not tell him to do that." It went out like this: "F you, f you, f you, you're cool, f you, I'm out." Now that's a Chad move. Story 8. My PE teacher in the 9th grade got fired for this. She tells us to walk laps around the school for cardio day. Some kids decided to run and managed to finish 3 laps by the time the rest of us finished like 2. When we finished our 2nd lap, we see the runners sitting, and the teacher just screams, "Get your goddamn puny ass over here." She proceeds to push the whole class onto the track in 97-degree weather and make us sprint a mile and says that anyone who got below a 7:30 had to run it again. It was like a 90-minute period. Everyone finishes and she sits down and calls us a multitude of bad words and tells us that we should have finished 3 laps as they did instead of only doing 2, even though she told us to walk, not run. And they were running. The whole time we noticed that a girl isn't here anymore. We later found out that she had to be taken away in an ambulance because she had asthma and our bitch of a teacher denied her her inhaler. So she fainted and was taken to the nurse's office immediately. Story 9. I worked at Taco Bell while in high school. One of my coworkers was this guy who was really friendly but also really strange. He was obsessed with being a straight-edge kid and drew the X's on his hand in the whole 9 yards. He had a high-pitched but pleasant voice and spoke in an overly polite manner. Anyway, he had put in his 2 weeks, and on his last day he was working the front counter register. This lady walks up to order and he just stares at her. After a few seconds, she says, can you take my order? In his very calm and polite voice, he says, "Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am, but I cannot." There was another awkward pause and she said, well, why not? He responds with, "Because I am a dinosaur!" He immediately started growling and roaring at her, and he walked back and forth behind the counter like a T-Rex. He did this until the manager, who was back making food, realized what was going on. On our way up to the counter, he calmly clocked out and left. The manager had to apologize over and over to the poor woman trying to order. That kid was a Taco Bell legend for several years. Story 10. I wasn't there to see it, but my coworkers have talked about the cabinet incident. Last year was my first year of teaching, and I was working in a low-income inner-city school. People kept saying to me, "There's no way you could possibly be worse than the last girl we had." When I asked them what they meant, I was told that a few years prior the principal had hired a first-year teacher. Apparently one day she got so overwhelmed and upset by the behavior of her class that she chucked a ream of paper out the window, and then ran into the back room, shut herself in a big cabinet, and cried. Her class was unsupervised for a while. Apparently none of the kids had told anyone what happened. And when the principal found her, she was curled up on the floor of the cabinet, rocking back and forth and sobbing. Clearly, she was fired soon after that. I didn't stay at that school longer than a year because the principal was the equivalent of Satan. But when I left, she said to me, "Despite all the shit you were put through this year from your kids, you're the first teacher I can remember who I never saw cry at school." I'll take that as a compliment, I suppose. Story 11. First, this involves the new $5 notes. For those who don't know, they're polymer notes, and if you fold them up, they tend to stay folded. It's important for the story. I served a customer, a friendly old man with white hair, who paid with a folded £5. I put it in the till. A few minutes later, my boss was in the till and he saw the folded note. He decided that the folds meant that it had been rolled up into a tube to snort coke with. He was absolutely adamant. I said, "No, I just took the notes from an old man." He started yelling, rolling the note up his fingers to make a tube, shouting at me, "Look, it rolls up like this. Don't tell me I don't know what I'm talking about. Don't tell me I'm wrong." He kept shouting at me, basically waiting for me to apologize and back down, saying I was wrong. But I wasn't, so I didn't. He wound up storming off, throwing things and slamming things. He's insane, and I should have complained, but there would have been no point. Everyone knows what he's like and no one cares. Story 12. One of my old coworkers told me about the biggest meltdown he ever saw. The job was pretty high stress to begin with, and people were always on the verge of screaming at each other. So this guy, let's call him Jake, had been working 12 to 14-hour days. Was on call for 24 hours, had 2 hours of commuting a day. He said he never saw his girlfriend who he lived with. Missed his niece's first birthday because of work. The dude was on the edge. Enter Sally. Sally was in charge of invoicing and had spent her whole previous week on vacation spending time with her daughter that was visiting. She came in on a Monday to finish up some billing but was taking the rest of the week off for more vacation. She approached Jake while he was in the middle of working on some major issues, saying he needed to get some things for her to finish billing. Jake told her that he would get to it as soon as he could. Sally continued to ask every 10 minutes, getting more irritated with each request. Finally, she entered Jake's office, a big open area shared with the coworker mentioned above, and nastily says, "It'd be real nice if you did your job so I can go home and see my family." Jake proceeded to kick the door open behind him, breaking the frame and the automatic closer. At the end of the hall, he kicked another door open, putting a hole in the wall behind it. He then went to the equipment storage area and began throwing pieces of metal rigging, making a ton of noise. This drew the attention of others who came to check out what was going on. When someone asked what was going on, Jake said, "If that says one more word to me, I'll be leaving in the back of a cop car." Sally was gone by the time Jake calmed down enough to go back inside. Jake wasn't fired or even written up. Management knew that he was under stress and Sally was told to keep her distance. Also, Jake is me. My blood pressure was so high my vision went blurry. So, did you end up getting her stuff for the billing, or? Story 13. The best I've seen was my 7th grade math teacher. There was a girl who always talked in class. She got moved to the front at some point, and she was laughing and giggling as always. After being told to be quiet about 8 times, the teacher is standing front and center in front of her, back to her, and wrote an example on the board. The girl has one of those plastic pencil boxes all the girls used to decorate sitting on the front corner of her desk. The teacher just cracked. In one smooth motion, he spins around, yells, "Shut up!" and smacks the box as hard as he can, and it goes 15 feet flying across the room and smashes into a wall. Pencils freaking everywhere. He swiftly walks to the door, slams it shut, and we could hear pounding on the wall. One brave kid peeks out of the window. Dude was banging his head against the wall. About 2 minutes later, he walks back in. Crickets, not a noise in the classroom. He begins walking around picking up every single pen and pencil, puts them all in the box, and places it gently on her desk. And then he continues the example like nothing ever happened. It was exquisite. Story 14. I'm in radio, and one of the groups of stations I worked at had an oldies station, a rock station, and a pop station in the same building. We had an announcer who was really eager and wanted to learn and work and was really a great guy. But the boxes were total jerks to him and were stuck in their old ways of doing things. They treated the announcer, we'll call him Howard, really poorly, and Howard used to come in and vent about it. He ended up getting hired at another station, but before he left, he went into the music libraries and replaced all the Led Zeppelin songs on the rock station with a gospel song from the oldies station called Trumpets of Jesus. For an entire weekend, anytime Led Zeppelin was supposed to play, Trumpets of Jesus played instead. Howard has since gone on to become a program director and has won all kinds of leadership awards, a total legend. Hey guys, hope you're enjoying the video. If so, feel free to like and subscribe as it really helps us a lot. Anyway, back to the stories. Story 15. I used to work at a kitchen in an old folk home. I had a manager named Edward who was a know-it-all piece of uninformed shit. I had a coworker named Evelyn who had a very serious medical condition and required a certain medication at certain points of the day. Edward didn't like Evelyn or the fact that she needed to keep up with her medication on her person. One day, Evelyn forgot her medication and begged to run home and retrieve it. Edward smugly denied her and told her to finish work. So she tried and ended up briefly collapsing. She was okay but very weak and disoriented. Edward grabbed her by the arm, escorted her to her car, handed her the keys, and told her to leave. Then he left, to go tell anyone that would listen that Evelyn was on drugs and he smelled booze on her. Evelyn was in the parking lot and called her mom to take her to the hospital. Evelyn was only 20 and very scared. She was discharged that night after some fluids and came back the next day, upon hearing what Edward told everyone about her. She immediately stormed into HR screaming for them to bring Edward's ass into the office immediately. As soon as he was called in, she whipped her name tag at him. I obviously lingered close like a nosy bitch. She was screaming at the top of her lungs that Edward denied her to go home and get her medication, which was on file and he was very well aware of. And how dare he accuse her of being a drug addict? And if he really believed that she was under the influence of something, how stupid was he to put her in a car on the company's property, leaving them viable for her damages? At this point, much noise can be heard as all three of them are screaming full force at one another. She threatened legal action and stormed out. Well, she did take legal action, for a ton of shit, including putting a clearly ill person behind the wheel. Not too long after this, I also quit. A few months later, Edward was no longer employed by the kitchen, but rather was working as a delivery boy in the local grocery store. I don't know what happened with Evelyn's lawsuit, but I hope that place and Edward got everything they deserved. Also, an honorable mention to Randy, the maintenance man that threatened to shoot my old boss in the face for being such a d***less weasel. Story 16. I had a coworker freak out on a customer at Walmart. I used to be a cashier and people used to tend to treat us like shit. Anyway, the lady got pissy because she couldn't price match some Doritos. After all, it was the wrong size or something. Anyway, it escalates and we can't find the manager, and a few minutes later they are screaming at each other. The cashier's parting words were, "I ain't price matching your Doritos. You don't even need those Doritos with your fat ass." Needless to say, that was her last day. Story 17. Working a retail summer job. A forklift driver was moving a skid of pickled eggs that wasn't properly wrapped. It fell and a ton of juice and eggs went everywhere. The manager comes out and takes off the hat and throws it on the ground while yelling, "God damn it!" After he went full Gunnery Sergeant Hartman on the dude's ass for f***ing up. It was enough to make him cry and quit the next day. Some follow-up. Mr. Manager was with HR the next day, lost his manager position for a few months. When he got his manager position back, he was pretty chill from then on. Some of our younger guys don't like it as much because his outbursts were quite funny. I remember one time I was getting an earful and I could hear some of my friends trying to contain their laughter in the next aisle. As for the forklift guy, he did come back and is now working mornings instead of evenings. Story 18. I worked in fast food for years, and while it might not be the most intense thing, this kid who worked 60+ hours a week at 17 came into work one day with a completely shaved head because it was more efficient to maintain and it helped him work more often. I have never seen someone so young be so dead inside and with that shiny of a head. Edit, the guy is a lot happier now and he's doing well for himself and is climbing the upper ranks in the fast food business. The dude is loaded, has a girlfriend, his own place, and a full head of hair. He was loaded due to the fact that the guy worked ridiculous hours while not paying rent or bills. Being 17 had some perks for 2 years before he moved into his own place. He also didn't have much of a social life back then because of his crazy work grind, so the money just came rolling in. The guy is well on his way to becoming a franchise owner and it's well deserved. Story 19. We had this girl at work and she liked to wear pants that showed a significant portion of her ass. Like if her ass crack was the Gulf Coast of the US, with Key West being her ass, we were probably at Tallahassee. Someone complained to her manager. He didn't believe us, so we had to sit him in a meeting behind her and he was completely horrified. So he had a conversation with her about proper workplace clothing. Well, she never got the message, so she gets a phone call from HR giving a formal warning. She flips out, storms into the meeting, calls her boss a pervert, then proceeds to yell, "If you want to see my ass, then see this," and moons the room and storms off in a blaze of glory. It's more like, no, we're complaining specifically because we don't want to see your ass. Story 20. St. Paddy's Day. Irish, English, Scotch pub in Central Texas. Busiest day of the year by a factor of 3. Live music all day, including a local famous singer. Rented tables on the lawn, in the parking lot, in the delivery driveway, the works. The menu was limited to a few burgers, 2 basic salads, and a few shareable sides. The special, corned beef and cabbage, and the classic fish and chips. At that time, we had about 1,000 customers cussing, 20 waiters waiting, 7 cooks a-cooking, and 1 expediter, a singular bottleneck position whose job is coordination, quality control, and communication between the front and the back of the restaurant. He'd been working most of the day without a break. Ticket times are usually about 10 to 20 minutes, but the volume of orders led to some tables taking up to 40 minutes, which would normally be unacceptable, except this was a festival atmosphere, so f*** you if you complain. This normally unflappable, capable man was getting frustrated with the fry cooks, and we heard him finally shout, "We'll suck d for fish," to the cooks who were causing his work to back up. We still like to laugh about it though, but in the moment I could taste his frustration. Story 21. I think mine was the best one I've ever heard so far. I was working at a hardware store and had already given my 2 weeks notice, so I was on my last day as it was. Ended up getting a pretty nasty case of the flu, but I didn't want to bail on my last day, so I went to work anyway. I work in the outdoor department, so I decided to go inside and do sales and let someone else reap the commission benefits since it was my last day. We were undergoing an audit from corporate, and they showed up right as I was wrapping up a sale and wanted to know what I'd been doing outside of my department. I told him I was hanging out and making sales because my sinuses hurt and I wasn't feeling well. He then got really snappy with me and said in a condescending tone, "You're just hanging out?" I responded with, "Yes, hanging out and making sales." He told me I should get off my ass and get back to my department. I took off the company vest that we were wearing, rolled it up in a ball, and threw it in his face like a baseball. I then told him to shove it up his ass, and I turned around and walked out. My friends called me later and told me that he went into a complete rage and demanded that I be fired immediately. The store manager started to laugh once he realized the story and told the guy that it was my last day and I only had 2 hours left of that shift as it was. To this day, I don't know if I've been blacklisted from that company or not, but I know I'd never work there again anyway.